Welcome to the video on Chapter 5 from our Labor Law and Collective Bargaining class. Chapter 5 is really about strategy. How are the decisions made for labor unions and for management? So we're going to start with something that's not in your textbook called the Conceptual Framework. We'll talk briefly about environment and constraints, union strategy, and then management strategy. This image comes from a textbook by Katz and Cochin and is our framework of collective bargaining. Up to this point, we have primarily spent our time talking about the external environment. We're now going to start to think at the strategic level, and then throughout the course of the rest of the semester, we will get into the functional level and the workplace level. We'll talk specifically about the bargaining process, bargaining outcomes, how the contract is carried out, and conflict resolution. Up to this point, we've spent the semester focusing on environment and constraints. We've talked a lot about the legal framework. That's the set of laws and the framework for business and labor management interactions. We've talked quite a bit about the economic circumstances as well, the labor markets, the product markets, and the broader economy. We've talked a little bit about the socio-political aspects, such as the political attitude towards labor and towards companies. We've talked about the ebb and flow that happens as the country becomes more conservative or less conservative. And we've mentioned briefly the lobbying efforts of various groups. Labor unions and companies are included in those groups. We've also talked a little bit about business ethics towards labor, and you've analyzed several cases in that regard. There are 6 broad ethical frameworks we've talked about before. Utility, the greatest good for the greatest number. The tool that we use is cost-benefit analysis. Immoral acts are things that are inefficient or welfare-reducing behavior. That's one way of viewing things, and economists often spend a lot of their time in that school of ethics. There's also a school of ethics called liberty, the freedom to be left alone. The tool is property rights. The immoral acts here would be forcing people to do things against their will. And then we have several other schools of thought here. So we talked a little bit about fairness. We talked about virtue really being things like friendliness and truthfulness. And we've talked quite a bit about care, even though we didn't use that specific name for the framework we were talking about. We discussed this when we were talking about how our Business 305 class taught by Tom Prince overlaps this class, where managers have some responsibility to foster and care for their employees. So the goal from this ethical framework is nurturing personal relationships. And we fall down or fail when we don't develop those relationships, or the relationship is based on something like exploitation. From a labor relations perspective then, the utility school would say a management's desire to be union-free is based on a cost-benefit analysis. Provisions of equity and voice only happen if they increase productivity. The Liberty School of Ethics would say that employers participate in the union organizing process because of their rights of private property and free speech. The Duty School says employees are entitled to voice because they are rational human beings who should not be treated only as the means to some other end. The Fairness School says unions negotiate compressed wage structures which narrow the gap between unskilled and skilled workers in the name of fairness. The Virtue School says might doesn't make right. Rather, establishing productive workplaces or engaging in collective bargaining is based on excellence and integrity. The Care School of Ethics says recent union initiatives to organize workers is done to develop special relationships with the workers, especially in female-dominated occupations. So we want to think about the union strategy from the 30,000-foot level. Unions have historically been in this frame of mind called business unionism, where the focus was on strong workplace unions, collective bargaining, equity through workplace union protection, and voice through union representation. This has been the primary philosophy since 1950. But there is pressure to change, and that pressure to change is pushing us towards something called social unionism. Business unionism has focused on a servicing model to pursue job control unionism through industrial unions. Social unionism sees labor unions as more than workplace mechanisms for winning economic gains. In other words, we're going beyond the typical servicing model to something deeper. So instead of just focusing on stronger workplace unions, under social unionism, we would look at strong community networks. Instead of just collective bargaining, we're going to see workplace, social, and political action. Instead of accepting capitalism as given, we're now more critical of the status quo. And instead of just equity through union protection, we're looking at equity through social justice. Voice has moved beyond the union to a political and social movement. So we're seeing the pursuit of equity and the pursuit of voice extending to the broader concerns of social justice throughout society. In the old model, the servicing model, workers pay dues in return for protection through collective bargaining and the grievance procedure. We'll spend a good amount of time talking about the grievance procedure in a coming chapter. And workers are considered to consume union services. The new organizing model, the model that many unions are moving towards, mobilizes workers for empowerment and action. So we're less focused on what the union can do for us, and we're more focused on what we can do for broader social issues. Workers participate in the union instead of just consuming services, and workplace activities include organizing. In the old job control unionism, there was focus on specific job rights, things like seniority, equity through standardization and equal treatment, and voice through union representation. But we now see this employee empowerment unionism that's coming in, and this is going to focus on creating procedures for empowerment. Skills are important, not just seniority. Equity through fair process, and voice through empowerment. So workers are really focusing more and more on having their individual voices heard and using the union to help them get that done. The industrial unionism represented all workers at a single workplace. We wanted all workers to be able to be on the same contract, even if they had different jobs, and all of them to be covered at that single workplace. We now see a pressure towards single occupation or craft unions, and these would represent workers in that single occupation across multiple workplaces. The industrial union gave us bargaining power for the entire workplace, but that left a lot of the needs of the individual workers in the different crafts left unaddressed. So there's pressure towards the craft unionization because we have these homogeneous occupations that have comparable needs. This diagram offers us a glimpse at the structure of the U.S. labor movement. So we'll zoom in here a little bit, and we'll start at the local level. At the local level, we have local unions. These local unions are representing individual people in the workplace. They're doing things like handling the day-to-day grievances that might arise from somebody feeling like the contract isn't being executed properly. That could be on the management side or on the union side. The local union is involved in all activities associated with the union. So not just the handling of carrying out the contract in the grievance process, but also union organizing, collective bargaining, and political activities. Those local unions are typically organized under a regional office. They may also have an industry conference. That depends on the local union and the crafts that it organizes. Those local unions confer with the regional office. The regional office helps them with things like grievance handling. And then this begins to move towards a more national level. Those locals are part of a regional, the regionals are part of a national union. The national union typically does not get involved in the grievance process at all, but will have some departments in that national union that help with things like union organizing. And then typically, but not always, the national union is involved in collective bargaining. The national union charters the local unions and often has final approval over local union actions. National unions are responsible for organizing new members, providing research and training, lobbying the legislators, and providing strike benefits. They also supervise the collective bargaining process. The national unions are governed through traditional democratic methods. The officers that run the national union are all elected. as well as the members of the executive committee. We're going to focus on only two management strategies, one that's autocratic and another that is paternalistic/strategic. These are really the two sort of ends of the spectrum from each other. The business strategy in an autocratic setup is focused on cost. The whole goal for the company in the human resource branch would be to minimize labor costs. Supervision is done through the drive mechanism we talked about before. Employees are treated more like commodities or machines, and their mechanism for voice basically involves leaving the company if they're not satisfied. In an autocratic work environment, if a union is accepted, the company takes on a very adversarial role towards the union. If the union is not in the company would take a very suppressive role in an attempt to not allow a union to come into the workplace to begin with. The other side of the coin here is a more paternalistic or strategic perspective. These companies tend to focus on differentiation. In other words, trying to make our company or product or service different from our competitors. The human resource strategy sounds more like what you would have heard in Business 305 with Prince. Develop, reward, and empower your employees. If you do this, they will be more loyal to you. Instead of driving workers, pressing them, forcing them, we look to inspire them. So lead by example. Encourage. Employees are treated as assets. If we treat employees like assets, they feel valued, and they're willing to give more to the company. In a case like this, if a company has chosen to accept the union, there would be a more participatory strategy. In other words, the company would figure out how to work collaboratively with the union. If they have not accepted a union and are trying to avoid a union, they will attempt to substitute for the union. In other words, the company will offer the employees the things the union would have offered them anyway, or at least a lot of those things. Voice is much more likely to happen in a paternalistic structure and often is part of the core strategy. If a company is attempting to avoid union, they can suppress the union or they can attempt to substitute for the union. And we've just seen on the previous slide that the company may do one or the other depending on the kind of strategy it's taking on with regard to workers. Union suppression includes things like firing or harassing union supporters. Screening out pro-union applications. So we had a business and ethics conversation in our homework a while back about a plant that intentionally located in a place where the union did not already exist. That's a form of screening out pro-union applications. They can do things like plant closings or double breasting. Double breasting means having one part of the business that is union, but another part of the business that is not union. And over time, often more and more of the work gets shifted to the non-union part of the organization. You can see there are a number of other ways that we can suppress the union here. Another very interesting one to discuss is surface bargaining. Instead of bargaining in good faith, we may bargain about things that are not important and are really considered on the surface. We can also do things like permanent strike replacements, which you'll see when you watch the movie about Hormel called American Dream. Union substitution is a more paternalistic approach. We're attempting, in this case, to take care of our workers better so that they don't have a desire to have the union. So we do things like offer them an efficiency wage, something above market, and also maybe better benefits than they would get out in the market in general. We offer them opportunities for training and development. We want to see our workers grow. We offer respectful supervision so that workers feel like they're being treated like humans. We create a complaint or grievance procedure that allows employees to make complaints about unfair working conditions. We offer job security. Job security is one of the biggest issues in today's economy. I don't know if I'm going to have a job tomorrow or not. That makes me feel more hostile towards the company. They can do things like survey the workers. How do you like your current health benefits? What are the issues with those? They do things like information sharing. If they share the information, there's much less mystery going on how an organization is being managed. Information sharing allows the employees to feel like they're more part of the team and they don't feel as adversarial towards the bosses. Plus, if you share information on how the company is doing, the workers are more likely to get on board with what the company needs. And they do things like quality circles. Quality circles is an opportunity for a random selected group of employees to be able to sit down with management and have conversations about how the company is running. How could they do things better? What things need changed? So clearly there are different ways of managing an organization. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again soon.